Hello, and thank you so much for joining. This is the webinar on the H2A and H2B programs, what your business needs to know. My name is Megan Wright, and I am Director of Industry Relations here at másLabor. Before we get going, just want to announce that we are very excited to both announce and kick off our partnership with the Ohio Green Industry Association. As a proud Ohio native myself, I am really looking forward to working more closely with as many of you as possible, and of course, supporting the Ohio green industry. So in this webinar, we are absolutely going to dive into the scope of each program, a lot of the history, some of the basics, really what are you needing to pay attention to in order to enter into these programs for the first time. Talk then about program viability and requirements, who is eligible, and then really think through some strategies of how to potentially participate in both programs simultaneously, or even enter into either or of the programs for the first time. We're really seeing that demand for crossover employers grow exponentially as we continue to really work through these labor shortages. So getting in here now to some of the history. In 1952, the Immigration and Nationality Act, or INA, really created the H-2 visa classification for all temporary workers. Then in 86, with IRCA, or the Immigration Reform and Control Act, really divided this program into the two that we know today. The H-2A program, designed for temporary or seasonal agricultural workers, and the H-2B program in turn then designed for temporary non-agricultural labor needs. And so agriculture is really broadly defined for the purposes of H-2A eligibility. Employers really need to think through making sure that they satisfy either the Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA definition, or the Internal Revenue Code, or IRC definition. And those are split into primary agriculture, which is what we think of when we're really planting, cultivating, harvesting, doing that work there directly on the farm, or then secondary agriculture, meaning activities that are performed either by a farmer or on a farm incident to the overall farming operation. So think of a packing house, or maybe transporting those commodities that had previously been grown to maturity on the farm. Non-agricultural then, of course, for eligibility is effectively everything but agriculture for H-2B. And landscapers actually make up the largest program demographic. One of the biggest distinctions to note, of course, between the two programs, and what we'll get into even more in subsequent slides, is that the H-2A program is uncapped. This means that there is no limit to the number of agricultural workers hired in the program. And this is, of course, because agriculture is deemed a matter of national security. The H-2B program, on the other hand, is capped at 66,000 visas per year, divided into equal allotments for the two halves of the government fiscal year. That means the first half, when the government fiscal year starts on October 1st, which is the fall or winter allotment, and then the second half, or the spring filing, which is for April 1st start dates. In the past several years, the demand for H-2B visas has absolutely exceeded the available supply many times over. And as you can imagine, most of that demand is coming for that spring allotment, or that April 1st start date. Something to note here, as we are in the middle of April, this is peak enrollment time for that first half, that October 1st start date. So even though October 1st feels like quite a ways away, this is the timeline to begin that process if you're considering using the H-2B program for the fall or winter. And so Certainly permanent cap relief is needed, but that does require an act of Congress. Usually in recent years, through the appropriations process, we have been noticing that there is cap relief. Actually, even right now, we are waiting the official final rule on an additional 35,000 visas that were added to that second half of fiscal year 2022 for the April 1st of this year. And so for enterprising employers, maybe folks that want to take advantage of trying to avoid or mitigate that spring visa cap, is to actually file an October 1st order to finish out their season, and then file again on the April 1st, or that second half of the fiscal year allotment. This would mean that their workers that they filed for October 1st are actually cap exempt, because they would be coming back for the second half of that fiscal year. So certainly an imperfect solution, and also puts a little bit more pressure now onto that winter cap allotment, but for this point, one strategy to try and mitigate again the visa cap for that April 1st filing. And so now, when we continue talking about program eligibility, we've already talked about that first half for H-2A with the definition of what is agriculture. The second half of that eligibility equation is making sure that the agricultural labor need is either temporary or seasonal. Seasonal for the H-2A program means that it is tied to a certain time of year, so it'd be recurring by an event or a pattern, aka the growing season, or by requiring labor levels that are far and above ongoing operations. And so here it's clear that this definition of seasonal assumes that there are year-round operations happening. A seasonal one is just a labor need that goes well and above your current workforce, so a supplement to the year-round workers. In H-2B, then, there are two types of temporary work, seasonal and peak load. So seasonal in the H-2B program is different than H-2A, and it's more in line with what you think of when you hear seasonal. So meaning that the need happens certain times of the year. Peak load, in turn, is more akin to that H-2A definition of seasonal, meaning, again, it assumes that there are year-round operation, but it has a peak to the labor need during several months. So let's take landscaping operations that are happening in more temperate regions of the US, where work is very much performed year-round, but clearly would ramp up in the spring, summer, and fall months. Be an example of peak load. Moving now into some of the program similarities, we certainly will talk about the key differences between the two programs, but it's also important to start out where they're similar. In both programs, there is a substantial U.S. recruitment requirement, meaning that employers must engage in positive recruitment of U.S. workers to, in turn, demonstrate the insufficiency and the eligibility to bring in these non-immigrant seasonal workers. Also, there is a similar filing process by way of the government agencies involved in going through the filings. Some additional program similarities are, of course, wage rate, knowing that employers must pay a dictated minimum wage that is established by the Department of Labor, mostly in place to protect the wages of similarly employed U.S. workers. There's also a travel reimbursement requirement for both programs, meaning that employers are responsible for both inbound and outbound travel. Next, when it comes to earnings records, impeccable record keeping is a must for payroll on both programs, making sure that you are documenting appropriately and retaining said documentation for a minimum of 3 years. Now moving into key differences, you'll notice there are quite a few, but most importantly to keep aware of is that the H-2A program is definitely considered more challenging from a compliance perspective. And that really is due to the fact that farm workers enjoy unique worker protections, and there are many separate laws and regulations that apply only in an agricultural context. We've also found that enforcement is much more prevalent in the H-2A program, which really translates into a higher rate of audits or even wage and hour division investigations that happen in person. Also, we have to think through some more key differences here when it comes to timing. The H-2A program not being subject to a visa cap actually allows employers to choose their actual start date of need, meaning operationally, when do you physically need these workers to be on site. That also means then that the filing process itself can begin as late as 60 days from that start date of need. And in some cases, even later for what's called an emergency filing. So for example, if this year is your first year applying for the H-2A program as an operation, that filing process could actually be cut down even further to 45 days in advance of your intended start date. Also, when it comes to that process, the job order filing actually starts with the state in advance of the Department of Labor application. For H-2B, those happen simultaneously. For H-2A, the state workforce agency plays a much more significant role in that approval process, and that does have to happen first. We talked a little bit about wage rates, how the program is similar with having a dictated wage for both, but in the H-2A program, there is no need for a prevailing wage determination. In most cases, the applicable wage is actually a statewide minimum wage for all of the agricultural jobs within said state. That is called the AWER, or the Adverse Effect Wage Rate. And in most cases, workers are also exempt from federal overtime pay requirements. Then when it comes to recruitment, unlike H-2B, there is no internal posting requirement or obligation then in turn to contact a collective bargaining unit or representative. But in H-2A, the recruitment period is much longer, mostly lasting until the 50% point of the contract period itself. Next, when it comes to housing, H-2A employers have to provide housing free of charge, not only to the foreign H-2A workers, but also to non-local U.S. workers. And again, unlike the H-2B program, H-2A employers are not permitted to deduct a fair market value for the rent. I think one instance where programs diverge, especially here, is in corresponding employment. While the definition of this remains very similar, where we just want to ensure that we are not discriminating against U.S. workers by way of participating in the program, in the H-2A program, U.S. workers are entitled to all material forms of employment, mostly the wage rate, if they perform even a single duty set forth in the job order or that job description. So not holistically the same occupation, but actually going to the line items of the job order. And important to note too that there is no exemption for incumbent employees. Switching off of the differences now and moving over to what we're calling crossover potential, which is something very prevalent in the green industry and means that you could simultaneously use both programs at the same time. And so really what we see here is that you would use the H-2A program for your growing operation or your nursery work, and then the H-2B program for your landscaping operations. And so landscapers really facing pressure or increased pressure from the H-2B cap really then can turn to the H-2A program as almost more of a workforce shift So allocating available US workers to the landscaping side of the business, and then bringing in H2A workers to help on the nursery side of the operation. And so again, using both programs simultaneously is certainly legally permissible, but we do have to make sure that there are clean lines in the sand and making sure that there are no overlapping job duties between the two workers of the different visa classification. And so we really see this again between landscaping and agricultural job duties more on that nursery side for H2A. And so that brings me here again to making sure that we're paying attention to going back to that eligibility requirement. So if you are going to have H2A workers, all of their job duties must still qualify as agriculture. And again, to meet those requirements, a majority, meaning more than 50% of the horticultural products being handled must be grown by the employer. If more than 50% is considered outside product, again, meaning not grown to maturity by the employer, it is no longer considered agricultural in nature and therefore not eligible for H2A. Something to note then too, let's say that these workers are handling less than 50% outside product, but again, because you did not grow that to maturity, there's no longer the agricultural exemption to federal overtime. So they would be owed overtime in any work week, in which case they handled any amount of outside product. Another area of crossover potentially where you did not receive your H2B workers could be in horticultural product installation. This means, again, number one, that the products being installed were grown by the employer, so not installing any outside product. And then number two, that the installation must be subordinate to the growing operation, meaning that it cannot be a primary extension of the landscaping services being offered by way of the percentage of these job duties. And something else to consider, if you were lucky enough to also have your H2B workers arrive, installation as a job duty cannot be shared between the two programs. So making sure that you're thinking through how to allocate and how to separate these job duties if you are participating in both programs simultaneously. And lastly here, a question that we get all of the time is, I am just now starting a growing operation, or I really want to participate in the H2A program, but I don't have years of payroll history, or I want to begin my operation and use H2A workers that same year. Is that permissible? And the answer is yes. Something else that you might not have thought through is that you could actually use the H2A program to physically build a growing operation. For example, building a greenhouse, installing an irrigation system. Those job duties could qualify as H2A because ultimately they will be in support of that growing operation and taking place on the farm. Something else that you might be able to consider is if you need those greenhouses, let's say, erected outside of your normal seasonality, you could also qualify for what is called a one-time need. So let's say you need to build that greenhouse, but you don't want to affect your normal season for your subsequent nursery workers. You could file a one-time need to get that greenhouse built and then move into your normal seasonality. And so with that being said, I certainly want to ensure that you reach out to me directly with any questions. I am available either by email or by phone, and I look forward to being in touch. So thank you all so much.